The air was thick with a tension that could be felt by anyone within a 100-mile radius. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the cramped, aging prison, casting a cold, sterile light on the hardened faces of the inmates. But among them, there was one who stood out, not just for his reputation, but for his very presence. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the leader of the infamous Sinaloa cartel, a man whose name had become synonymous with power, fear, and the unimaginable wealth of the drug trade, was sitting behind bars. It was a sight that, for most, would seem like an impossibility. But to those who had watched his rise to power, it was only the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty, whispers, and, above all, mystery. In a world where the most dangerous criminals often met a bloody end or were locked away forever, El Chapo's story was far from over. The very fact that he had been captured, after years of evading authorities, seemed like the final page of his tale. Yet, deep within the bowels of that prison, something was stirring. What most didn't know, however, was that his mind, sharp, calculating, and always several steps ahead, was already plotting his escape. It was a question that no one could seem to answer: how could a man like El Chapo, one of the most wanted criminals in the world, manage to disappear so completely from the eyes of the authorities? It seemed as though he had vanished into thin air, a ghost leaving behind no trace, no clue, and no explanation. The world watched in shock, disbelief, and fascination as news spread of the escape. How had it happened? How had a man who had been behind bars for months, if not years, managed to slip away, not just once but multiple times? El Chapo's escape wasn't just another story of a criminal on the run. It was a story that spoke to the very core of his persona, elusive, untouchable, and always ahead of his enemies. His escape was a spectacle, a triumph of willpower, strategy, and a nearly mythical level of preparation. It was a tale that defied logic, that defied the very concept of what was possible for someone like him. It was as if he had orchestrated his vanishing act like a magician, using smoke and mirrors, blending into the shadows just as his name had once done. But before the world would witness this legendary escape, they had to understand who El Chapo was, a man who had spent his life building a criminal empire so vast that it spanned continents, a man who had risen from the poorest corners of Mexico to become the most feared drug lord in the world. He wasn't born into power. In fact, he had come from nothing, an impoverished background in rural Sinaloa, where survival meant outwitting, outrunning, and outlasting everyone around you. His rise was not one of luck, but of cunning and a relentless ambition to climb to the very top of the drug trade. Growing up in the mountains of Sinaloa, where the streets were lined with dust and the air thick with the scent of the earth, young Joaquin had already begun to realize that life was a game of power. It wasn't just about the physical strength to survive, it was about the mental game, the manipulation of those around you, the quiet whispers in the dark, and the ability to make people believe that you were someone they couldn't afford to cross. He saw this power play in the local drug trade, where control over the most valuable commodity, cocaine, meant wealth, influence, and protection. And it was in this world that El Chapo would take his first steps toward greatness. His climb to the top was not easy. It was brutal. Filled with betrayals, murders, and a steady trail of bloodshed, El Chapo's early years in the drug business were characterized by his ability to stay in the shadows, never revealing too much, never showing his hand. As the Sinaloa cartel expanded its reach, so too did El Chapo's influence grow. It wasn't just about the drugs anymore. It was about controlling the routes, the networks, the supply chains. El Chapo knew that in order to control the drug trade, he had to control the flow, control the movement, the distribution, and, most importantly, the people. The cartel wasn't just a business, it was a kingdom, and El Chapo was its king. But as his empire expanded, so too did the enemies who sought to tear him down. Rival cartels, law enforcement agencies, and even the Mexican government were all gunning for him. Yet El Chapo remained a ghost, never seen, always one step ahead, his escape routes planned out well before anyone knew they existed. To catch him was like trying to catch the wind. No matter how hard they tried, the authorities could never quite pin him down. Then, of course, there was the infamous escape from the prison, the one that would go down in history as a masterstroke of brilliance. To those who had been watching him, it wasn't a surprise. It was exactly what they had expected. El Chapo had always been the type of man who thrived in the face of adversity, who could turn any setback into a new opportunity. And in that prison, with walls thick enough to keep the most dangerous criminals locked away, he had managed to do the impossible. He had escaped. But the details of that escape remained shrouded in mystery. How had he done it? Was it an inside job? Did he have help from corrupt prison officials, or was it something even more elaborate, something more grandiose than anyone could have imagined? There were many theories, but none could explain the audacity of the act. El Chapo had vanished, and the world was left to wonder how he had done it. What followed was a frantic manhunt. Mexican authorities, American law enforcement, and even international agencies joined forces to track him down. Yet, for months, there was no sign of El Chapo. It was as though he had become a ghost once again, slipping through the cracks of society, moving unseen and unheard. For those who were watching from the outside, it was a story that seemed to grow in legend with every passing day. How long could he remain free? Would he be caught again? Or was this the start of a new era, a world in which El Chapo had truly become untouchable? The world was captivated. His story was more than just that of a drug lord, it was the story of a man who had learned to manipulate the very system that was supposed to keep him in check. It was a story of power, fear, and ultimately, freedom, the kind of freedom that only a few could ever truly comprehend. And as the years passed, the legend of El Chapo only grew. His name was whispered in the dark corners of the world, a symbol of both awe and terror, the man who had lived multiple lives, always managing to slip away, always managing to survive. But the question remained, would he ever truly be free, or was he forever destined to remain a ghost, caught between the worlds of the living and the dead? Joaquin Guzman Lora, better known as El Chapo, had not always been the figure that the world would come to know, one of the most feared and powerful drug lords to ever walk the earth. His story began not in the opulent halls of criminal empires or the treacherous corridors of prison, but in the dust-swept hills of rural Sinaloa. Born into poverty, Joaquin grew up in a world where survival meant more than just living, it meant outsmarting, outlasting, and constantly fighting against the forces that sought to crush him. It was a harsh reality, one that shaped his view of the world and set the stage for a life that would be as brutal as it was fascinating. The small, impoverished village where Joaquin was raised was nestled deep within the mountains of Sinaloa, a state notorious for its role in Mexico's drug trade. But back then, it wasn't the drug world that dominated his young mind, it was simple survival. His family was poor, often struggling to make ends meet. His father, a small-time farmer, worked tirelessly on the land, but there was always more work to be done than there were hands to do it. The young Joaquin learned early on that there were no guarantees in life, especially in a place where the wealthy held all the power and the poor, like his family, were often invisible. Despite the hardships, there was always something in Joaquin that pushed him forward, a drive to escape the cycle of poverty and the limitations that came with it. He watched his father work relentlessly, only to see little reward for his efforts. It was then that he began to understand the harsh truth: in order to rise above, in order to truly change his life, he would need to take matters into his own hands. And those hands, as he would soon discover, would be used for something far darker than anything his father had ever imagined. By his early teens, Joaquin had already begun to feel the pull of the world around him. The mountains of Sinaloa, with their jagged peaks and hidden valleys, were home to more than just his family, they were also the domain of the drug trade, a shadowy world where wealth flowed like a river and the rules of society didn't apply. As he wandered the village, he began to hear whispers about the cartels, the men who controlled the trade routes, who made decisions that reached far beyond the small towns and villages like his own. These were men of immense power, and they ruled with an iron fist. The more he heard about them, the more intrigued he became. And soon, Joaquin realized that the key to power, the key to wealth and influence, was wrapped up in the world of drugs. At first, he had no interest in becoming involved with the cartels. But as he grew older, he began to see the potential. His first step into the world of organized crime came not in a grand gesture, but through small, incremental moves. He worked as a low-level enforcer, running errands and assisting with the logistics of drug deals. He quickly learned the inner workings of the trade, the dangerous routes, the negotiations, and the brutal tactics employed by those who sought to control the flow of cocaine and marijuana. Joaquin's keen mind, combined with his quick adaptability, allowed him to rise swiftly through the ranks of the cartel. He had no grand ambition at first, he was simply a man trying to escape the poverty that had defined his early years. But as his reputation grew, so too did his aspirations. By the time he was in his early 20s, Joaquin had already gained the trust of some of the most powerful figures in the Sinaloa cartel. He was no longer just a small-time player, he was becoming a force to be reckoned with. It wasn't just his street smarts or his ability to navigate the complexities of the drug trade that set him apart, it was his understanding of people, his ability to read situations and move quickly, to shift allegiances and make decisions that kept him ahead of the game. In the cutthroat world of the cartels, these traits were more valuable than anything else. As his influence grew, so did his ruthlessness. Joaquin had quickly come to understand that in the world of organized crime, there was little room for sentiment. Loyalty was important, yes, but survival was more so. He learned to strike first, to eliminate threats before they could even materialize. This brutal pragmatism would serve him well, as he began to carve out a place for himself within the cartel. His power, once small and contained, was now expanding, one deal, one alliance, one betrayal at a time. But even as his power increased, Joaquin faced a constant threat. The drug world was one of constant danger, where alliances were fragile, and enemies lurked around every corner. Rival cartels, law enforcement, and even corrupt government officials posed an ever-present threat. Yet, despite the dangers, Joaquin's ambitions continued to grow. He didn't just want to be a part of the cartel, he wanted to control it. He wanted to lead. In the mid-1980s, the opportunity for Joaquin to seize control of the Sinaloa cartel finally arrived. The cartel's previous leader was killed in a violent clash with rivals, and the power vacuum left behind was the perfect chance for Joaquin to make his move. Armed with his vast knowledge of the drug trade and his ability to manipulate those around him, he quickly took control of the organization. But he didn't do so through sheer force, he used his mind, his charm, and his connections to win over key allies. Joaquin had become not just a participant in the drug trade, but its new kingpin. Under his leadership, the Sinaloa cartel grew to unprecedented levels of power. Joaquin's network stretched across borders, and he became a key player in the global drug trade, responsible for the transportation of millions of dollars worth of cocaine, marijuana, and methamphetamine into the United States. The cartel became a vast, sprawling empire, with Joaquin at the center, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. His name became synonymous with power and wealth, and yet he remained elusive, never seeking the spotlight, never flaunting his power in public. Instead, he operated in the shadows, like a ghost, always hidden from the world's prying eyes. But as his empire grew, so too did the risks. The more powerful Joaquin became, the more enemies he made. Rivals, law enforcement, and even members of his own cartel began plotting against him. Yet, despite the dangers, Joaquin's grip on power remained firm. He had learned to survive in a world where death was a constant threat, and his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of organized crime was unmatched. As his empire flourished, Joaquin had to confront the complexities of his own life. Despite his wealth and power, there were still cracks in his carefully constructed world. The fear of betrayal loomed large, and he began to realize that his ambition had brought him into a world where even the closest of allies could turn on you in an instant. The paranoia began to set in. It was no longer enough to simply control the cartel, he had to control the people within it, too. The mounting pressure of maintaining control over his empire weighed heavily on Joaquin. In a world where loyalty could turn to betrayal in the blink of an eye, he found himself increasingly isolated. And yet, despite the growing danger and uncertainty, Joaquin remained determined to hold on to his power. His rise, from a poor boy in the mountains of Sinaloa to the head of one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations, was a testament to his unyielding ambition and his ability to survive in a world that was constantly trying to tear him down. The world of the Sinaloa cartel was not one for the faint of heart. It was a realm of blood, sweat, and brutality, where survival was a daily challenge and power was something that had to be seized, and held at any cost. Joaquin Guzman, known as El Chapo, had learned early on that in the cutthroat world of organized crime, the price of admission was steep. Yet, despite the dangers that came with this life, it was a world where he could finally escape the limitations of his past. No longer would he be shackled by the poverty of his childhood, nor the crushing weight of an oppressive system. In the cartel, he found a place where his cunning, ruthlessness, and strategic mind could flourish. At first, El Chapo's involvement with the cartel had been more accidental than planned. He had started small, working as a low-level enforcer for the cartel's operations in the mountains of Sinaloa. His role was to ensure that the drug shipments, primarily marijuana, made it safely to their destinations. These were the early days of his criminal career, and at this point, Joaquin didn't have grand aspirations. He wasn't aiming for power yet, he was just trying to make a name for himself, to gain the respect of the men who controlled the flow of drugs. But even in these early stages, his intelligence and work ethic set him apart. He had learned the ropes of the trade quickly, absorbing the nuances of the drug business like a sponge. While others might have focused on the physical aspects of smuggling or violence, El Chapo began to understand something far more important, the logistics of the trade. This was the true heart of the drug business. It wasn't just about getting the drugs from point A to point B, it was about how to do so without getting caught, how to outwit law enforcement and rival cartels, how to build a network of allies and informants that could give you an edge. This was where El Chapo shined. His ability to manage people, to negotiate and build trust, quickly earned him a reputation as a valuable asset to the cartel. While El Chapo's skills were undeniable, what really set him apart was his relentless ambition. He wasn't content with just being another cog in the machine. He didn't want to merely exist within the cartel, he wanted to control it. And it wasn't just the Sinaloa cartel he wanted to control, he wanted to dominate the entire drug trade. His vision wasn't confined by borders or boundaries. He saw the cartel not just as a means to an end, but as the foundation for a global empire, one that could stretch from the mountains of Mexico to the streets of the United States, and beyond. To achieve this, El Chapo had to understand the delicate balance of power. The cartel, like any business, required careful management. But in the world of organized crime, business wasn't the only thing that mattered. The cartel was also a violent, ruthless world, where loyalty could turn into betrayal in the blink of an eye. El Chapo was acutely aware of this, and he took steps to ensure that his position within the cartel was unassailable. He made alliances with the right people, men who could protect him, who could expand his reach, and who could help him eliminate threats. He learned to manage both the business side of the cartel and the violent side, understanding that both were equally important for maintaining control. By the late 1980s, El Chapo's reputation had grown exponentially. He wasn't just a trusted enforcer anymore, he was becoming a key player within the cartel. His ability to smuggle drugs across the U.S.-Mexico border had earned him the nickname El Chapo, which referred to his short stature but formidable presence. But while his size might have been small, his ambition was anything but. He had already begun plotting for a bigger role within the cartel. His success was built on the back of his growing influence over the transportation routes and his strategic partnerships with other cartels. Yet, for all his success, El Chapo still had one major obstacle to overcome, the leadership of the Sinaloa cartel. The death of the cartel's former leader, Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo, in the late 1980s left a vacuum of power within the organization. Gallardo's leadership had been built on both his connections and his ability to navigate the complex world of Mexican politics and law enforcement. However, as his grip weakened, rival factions within the cartel began to fight for control. It was in this chaotic environment that El Chapo saw an opportunity to take the reins. Seizing power within the Sinaloa cartel wasn't an easy task. The cartel was divided, and there were numerous factions that had their own interests and allegiances. Yet El Chapo, who had built relationships with key figures within the organization, was able to outmaneuver his rivals. His knowledge of the trade, combined with his ability to manipulate those around him, allowed him to gain the loyalty of crucial members of the cartel. In time, he became the undisputed leader of the Sinaloa cartel. Once in control, El Chapo wasted no time in solidifying his position. He immediately began to expand the cartel's operations, focusing on increasing the flow of drugs into the United States. But his plans didn't stop there. El Chapo saw an opportunity to diversify the cartel's operations. He began to branch out into other illicit activities, including the smuggling of firearms, money laundering, and human trafficking. The cartel became an all-encompassing criminal enterprise, with El Chapo at the helm. Under El Chapo's leadership, the Sinaloa cartel became one of the most powerful and profitable criminal organizations in the world. His ability to control the flow of drugs, particularly cocaine, methamphetamine, and marijuana, into the United States gave him immense influence over the global drug market. But El Chapo didn't just focus on making money, he also sought to expand his empire, making strategic moves to ensure the cartel's continued success. He forged alliances with other cartels, strengthening his position in the world of organized crime. Yet, despite his growing power, El Chapo remained largely invisible to the outside world. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who craved the spotlight, El Chapo preferred to operate from the shadows, maintaining a low profile while pulling the strings behind the scenes. However, as the cartel's influence grew, so too did the attention on El Chapo. The Mexican government, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and rival cartels all began to take notice of his growing power. But El Chapo was always one step ahead. His ability to avoid capture was legendary, and he developed a network of informants and corrupt officials that allowed him to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. It wasn't just about avoiding the authorities, it was about controlling the narrative. He knew how to play the game, how to shift the blame, and how to eliminate threats before they became a problem. By the mid-1990s, El Chapo had built a vast empire that spanned continents. His cartel controlled smuggling routes into the United States, making billions of dollars in profits. The cartel's operations were as sophisticated as any multinational corporation, with El Chapo overseeing every aspect of the business. Yet, despite his success, there were cracks in the foundation of his empire. The higher El Chapo rose, the more enemies he made, both within and outside the cartel. Rival cartels sought to dethrone him, and law enforcement agencies were closing in. But El Chapo was no ordinary criminal, he had become a master of evasion, and his reign seemed unshakable. But as the years passed, the pressure began to mount. The weight of his empire, the constant threat of betrayal, and the ever-present fear of capture began to take their toll on El Chapo. He had reached the pinnacle of power, but the constant danger, the paranoia, and the weight of his own actions began to eat away at him. Still, despite the growing threats, El Chapo remained resolute, determined to hold on to the empire he had built, no matter the cost. The moment Joaquin Guzman Lora, known to the world as El Chapo, seized control of the Sinaloa cartel, it marked the beginning of a new era in the history of organized crime. Having navigated the brutal world of drug trafficking for years, he was now at the helm of one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the planet. What followed was the rapid expansion of the cartel's influence and operations, a testament to El Chapo's keen strategic mind and ruthless ambition. But with the newfound power came the inescapable reality: control of the Sinaloa cartel didn't just mean wealth, it meant constant danger, intricate alliances, and the ever-present risk of betrayal. El Chapo was a master at reading people and understanding the intricate web of relationships that formed the backbone of the drug trade. His rise was not just a result of his cunning business sense, but also his ability to manipulate those around him, forging alliances and eliminating threats with a cold, calculating efficiency. His leadership was marked by an unwavering focus on one goal: expansion. He knew that in the cutthroat world of the cartel, power was not a permanent fixture unless it was continually reinforced. As a result, El Chapo set his sights on increasing the cartel's reach, not just across Mexico, but globally. To understand El Chapo's rise, one must first understand the logistics of the cartel's operations. While most people might view drug trafficking as a violent, chaotic industry, El Chapo understood that success in this world depended on one key factor: control of the supply chain. The cartel didn't just need to produce drugs, it needed to control every aspect of their distribution. This meant controlling the routes by which drugs were smuggled into the United States, Europe, and beyond. El Chapo was no stranger to this. Having already established smuggling routes for marijuana and cocaine, his cartel was positioned perfectly to expand into the growing market for methamphetamine, which had exploded in popularity during the 1990s. El Chapo's strategy was clear: diversify, expand, and dominate. While other cartels had focused on a single commodity, cocaine or heroin, El Chapo understood that controlling multiple drug markets would make his cartel virtually untouchable. He set up complex networks of laboratories in Mexico, where methamphetamine could be produced in vast quantities, making it the cartel's primary source of revenue. The production of methamphetamine was an especially profitable business, given its low cost to produce and its high street value. It wasn't long before Sinaloa's methamphetamine production began to outpace its competitors, and El Chapo's cartel became the dominant force in the trade. But controlling the production of drugs was only part of El Chapo's master plan. He understood that in order to maintain his grip on power, he had to build an infrastructure of influence and intimidation. The Sinaloa cartel wasn't just a drug distribution network, it was a complex, multifaceted criminal enterprise. To keep the business running smoothly, El Chapo created a web of alliances with local gangs, corrupt law enforcement officials, and even government officials. His cartel was able to operate with relative impunity because it had deep roots in the very institutions that were supposed to stop it. The reach of the cartel extended beyond just the streets and borders, it infiltrated political and judicial systems, allowing El Chapo to stay one step ahead of any attempts to bring him down. With power came wealth. El Chapo's cartel was now generating billions of dollars annually, making it one of the most lucrative criminal organizations in history. The flow of money was staggering, with enormous amounts of cash coming from the sale of drugs in the United States, Canada, and beyond. The wealth allowed El Chapo to expand his reach even further, purchasing luxury homes, private jets, and even a fleet of high-end vehicles. He lived a life of unimaginable luxury, but he never lost sight of his true goal: to maintain control over the Sinaloa cartel and protect it from his many enemies. However, with wealth and power came greater threats. El Chapo was now in the crosshairs of rival cartels who sought to take him down and assume control of his operations. But more dangerous than any cartel was the threat of law enforcement. The United States and Mexico were now focusing their efforts on bringing him to justice. The DEA and Mexican authorities had long been tracking El Chapo, and his notoriety was only growing. He was no longer just a local figure, he was an international symbol of the drug trade's power and the dangerous allure of the cartel life. Yet El Chapo, ever the strategist, was not easily caught. He understood the importance of remaining hidden from authorities. His life had been built on staying one step ahead of the law, using a combination of old-school smuggling techniques and modern technology to avoid capture. He moved constantly, never staying in one place for too long. His ability to evade capture became almost legendary. He would frequently change his location, often hiding in remote areas of Mexico where the authorities couldn't reach him. His networks of loyal allies and corrupt officials ensured that he had a safe passage, even in the most dangerous of situations. It seemed as though El Chapo could never be caught, no matter how hard the authorities tried. Despite his careful planning and caution, however, El Chapo's life began to take a darker turn. As his power increased, so did the pressure to maintain it. He was constantly surrounded by threats, from rival cartels seeking to dethrone him, to law enforcement agencies determined to bring him to justice. The stress of leadership began to weigh heavily on him. El Chapo's empire was vast, but so were the dangers it brought. The deeper he sank into the world of crime, the more paranoid and isolated he became. His once close allies were now viewed with suspicion, and he began to rely more and more on force to maintain control. The paranoia that gripped El Chapo was not unfounded. The cartel world was filled with betrayal, and the line between loyalty and treachery was razor-thin. In a world where anyone could be bought, bribed, or coerced, El Chapo had to constantly watch his back. He surrounded himself with a loyal inner circle, but even within his closest allies, there were whispers of discontent and betrayal. El Chapo understood that in order to survive, he had to control every aspect of his empire, and that meant keeping his enemies close, and watching his friends even closer. Despite these growing tensions, El Chapo's cartel continued to thrive. By the mid-1990s, it was the most powerful and influential drug trafficking organization in Mexico, responsible for smuggling billions of dollars worth of drugs into the United States each year. His dominance in the drug trade was nearly unparalleled. However, with such immense power came the inevitability of downfall. His enemies, both inside and outside the cartel, were closing in. The Mexican government was starting to ramp up its efforts to take him down, and the U.S. government had made El Chapo a top priority for the DEA. The threat of capture loomed large, and El Chapo knew that in the volatile world of the cartels, no one could stay on top forever. Even as the walls began to close in, El Chapo's ambition never wavered. His eyes were always on the horizon, constantly planning his next move. He knew that his empire was built on a precarious foundation, but he was determined to hold on to it, no matter the cost. The Sinaloa cartel was his creation, and he would do everything in his power to ensure its continued dominance. For El Chapo, the price of power was high, but he was willing to pay it. The myth of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was already well established by the time he found himself behind bars for the first time. His reputation as a criminal mastermind, as the architect of the Sinaloa cartel's vast empire, was nothing short of legendary. He had been involved in every level of the drug trade, from smuggling cocaine across the border to controlling distribution networks across the United States and Europe. El Chapo's rise had been swift and brutal. His influence stretched far beyond Mexico's borders, and his name became synonymous with power, ruthlessness, and the dangerous allure of the cartel world. But in 1993, the walls began to close in. After years of evading law enforcement, El Chapo was finally arrested. The Mexican authorities, with the assistance of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, captured him in a dramatic operation that seemed to signify the end of his reign. He was charged with a multitude of crimes, including drug trafficking, murder, and organized crime. The arrest sent shockwaves through the world of organized crime, and many believed that it marked the downfall of one of the most notorious drug lords in history. But El Chapo's story was far from over. His first arrest would not be his last, and the brief period he spent in prison would prove to be one of the most pivotal moments in his life. While many criminals would have been content to serve their time in relative obscurity, El Chapo had other plans. It was in prison that the seeds for his most daring and remarkable escape were planted. He had come to understand the value of power, both inside and outside the walls of the penitentiary, and he was determined to maintain control of his empire, no matter the cost. During his time in prison, El Chapo faced a constant barrage of challenges. He was held in the infamous Altiplano prison, a maximum security facility that housed some of Mexico's most dangerous criminals. But despite the fortified walls and heavy security, El Chapo remained calm, calculating, and unbroken. In fact, his time in prison was not spent in despair but in meticulous planning. He knew that his cartel could not survive without him at the helm, and he was determined to escape the clutches of the Mexican government. El Chapo understood the value of being elusive, of disappearing without a trace when the time came. He had done it before, and he would do it again. He was a master at using his network of contacts, both inside and outside the prison, to orchestrate his escape. Through a combination of bribed guards, corrupt officials, and loyal associates, El Chapo was able to manipulate the prison system to his advantage. His ability to make alliances with people in positions of power, whether in law enforcement or within the criminal world, was a testament to his strategic brilliance. No one could have predicted the audacity of his plan. In July 2015, El Chapo pulled off what would become one of the most famous prison escapes in modern history. Using a tunnel that had been dug with surgical precision, he managed to escape from the Altiplano prison undetected. The tunnel, which was over a mile long and included a ventilation system, was a work of art in its own right. It was clear that El Chapo had thought of everything, nothing was left to chance. The tunnel opened up into a house several kilometers away, where a motorcycle was waiting to whisk him to safety. The escape sent shockwaves through Mexico and the world. For the second time, El Chapo had managed to slip through the fingers of law enforcement, becoming a ghost once more. His ability to disappear, even from the most secure prison in the country, reinforced his reputation as a figure who existed beyond the ordinary boundaries of the law. It was as though he had become a part of the very fabric of the criminal underworld, a force that could not be contained by any physical or legal barriers. For El Chapo, the escape was not just a personal triumph, it was a message. It was a statement to the world that he was untouchable, that no matter how many times the authorities tried to capture him, he would always find a way to elude them. His name would live on, a symbol of power, cunning, and defiance. The escape also had practical consequences for his cartel. With El Chapo free once again, the Sinaloa cartel was able to resume its operations, continuing to control vast territories and smuggling routes throughout Mexico and the United States. However, El Chapo's freedom was short-lived. After a period of evading capture, he was once again tracked down by Mexican authorities. In January 2016, El Chapo was arrested for a second time, this time in a raid on a condominium in the beach resort city of Mazatlan. His capture was the result of an intense, months-long manhunt that involved both Mexican and U.S. authorities. This time, El Chapo would not escape so easily. He was extradited to the United States, where he would face a trial that would capture the attention of the entire world. Despite his second arrest, the legend of El Chapo had already been cemented. His daring escape from Altiplano, and his subsequent capture, only added to his mystique. In the years following his capture, El Chapo's story continued to captivate the public's imagination. His trial in the United States was a spectacle in itself, drawing attention from media outlets across the globe. Throughout the trial, El Chapo remained composed and almost eerily calm. He never showed fear or regret, only the cold determination of a man who had lived his entire life in the shadows. The trial was an opportunity for prosecutors to lay bare the full extent of El Chapo's criminal empire. The evidence presented during the trial painted a chilling picture of the cartel's operations, the millions of dollars in profits, the gruesome violence, and the elaborate methods of smuggling drugs across the border. Yet, despite the overwhelming evidence against him, El Chapo remained defiant. He had built an empire that was beyond the reach of the law, and even in the face of certain conviction, he refused to show any sign of weakness. El Chapo's conviction in 2019 was the final chapter in his dramatic rise and fall. He was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 30 years for his role in the Sinaloa cartel's activities. His conviction was seen as a major victory for law enforcement and a symbol of the global fight against drug trafficking. However, even behind bars, El Chapo's legacy loomed large. The Sinaloa cartel continued to operate, albeit with diminished strength, and the myth of El Chapo persisted. The story of El Chapo's escape and subsequent capture is not just a tale of crime and punishment, it is a testament to the incredible lengths to which people will go to maintain power, even in the face of overwhelming odds. His rise from humble beginnings in the mountains of Sinaloa to becoming one of the most infamous drug lords in history is a story that continues to fascinate, shock, and inspire awe. Through it all, El Chapo remained a figure of both fear and fascination, his name etched into the annals of history as a symbol of the power, greed, and cunning that characterized the world of organized crime. El Chapo's story is far from over, even in his absence. It continues to inspire countless others, both within the criminal world and beyond, as a testament to the enduring allure of power and the lengths to which one man would go to maintain it. His life is a reminder that in the world of organized crime, nothing is ever truly finished. There are always new chapters, new escapes, and new legends waiting to be written. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's empire had become a sprawling network of influence and control, a testament to his genius as a strategist, a businessman, and a criminal mastermind. His rise to the top of the Sinaloa cartel was the result of sheer willpower, unrelenting ambition, and an uncanny ability to outmaneuver not just rivals, but law enforcement, government officials, and even his closest allies. Yet, with all the power and wealth he had accumulated, there remained one fundamental truth about El Chapo: he was constantly at war, not just with the authorities, but with the very world he had created. As the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo had constructed an empire that was unlike any other. It wasn't just the amount of drugs his cartel trafficked: cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana, and heroin, but the sophistication with which these operations were carried out. From the intricate network of tunnels that snaked beneath the U.S. Mexico border to the web of corrupt officials who protected his interests, El Chapo had built an organization that operated like a shadow government, existing in parallel with the one that enforced the law. But as powerful as El Chapo was, he was also an incredibly paranoid man. His leadership of the Sinaloa cartel was marked by the constant fear of betrayal, of rival cartels encroaching on his territory, or of even his own allies turning on him. This fear was not unfounded. The world of organized crime, especially within the Mexican drug cartels, was fraught with treachery. Loyalty, while valued, was often fleeting, and the price of betrayal was often paid in blood. El Chapo's ability to maintain control over his organization was in large part due to his brutal methods for managing his subordinates. He didn't just rule with fear, he ruled with precision, carefully orchestrating every move, every decision, and every relationship. This level of control was also necessary because the stakes had never been higher. The drug trade had evolved over the years, and with it, the risks associated with it. The U.S. government, through the DEA and other agencies, had turned its focus on El Chapo's cartel. And with increased law enforcement pressure came the need for even greater secrecy, better security, and more elaborate methods of evasion. El Chapo had survived countless close calls, but the nature of his empire was such that every day he spent as the leader of the Sinaloa cartel felt like a day spent in the crosshairs of law enforcement, rival cartels, and anyone who stood in his way. Despite his success, the cracks in El Chapo's empire began to show. His cartel, once a well-oiled machine, was now under constant threat. Rival cartels like the Zetas and the Gulf Cartel had been steadily gaining ground, and while El Chapo had been able to fend off many of their attempts to overtake his territories, it wasn't without cost. The violence in Mexico had reached new levels, and the war between the cartels was no longer a distant threat, it was a daily reality. These violent conflicts were not just about control of territories, they were also about personal power, the desire to be the top dog in a world where only one could claim the throne. El Chapo knew that if he was going to maintain his empire, he had to ensure that his cartel not only survived but thrived. He couldn't afford to let his rivals outmaneuver him, nor could he allow himself to be caught by the authorities. His ability to stay one step ahead of the law had become legendary. He had a vast network of informants, corrupt officials, and loyal enforcers who kept him informed of any potential threats. But even with all his resources, El Chapo's greatest asset was his ability to think ahead. He wasn't just reacting to threats, he was anticipating them. His ability to think several moves ahead was one of the reasons why El Chapo had been able to thrive in an environment that was inherently unstable. He didn't just rely on force or intimidation, he understood the importance of negotiation and diplomacy. Many of the alliances he made with rival cartels weren't forged through violence, but through carefully negotiated deals. El Chapo was willing to use every tool at his disposal to maintain his control. Sometimes that meant eliminating rivals or dissenters with extreme violence, but more often than not, it meant using his charm, his charisma, and his understanding of human nature to secure his position. Despite the growing threats from rival cartels and law enforcement, El Chapo's cartel remained the dominant force in the drug trade. His control over key smuggling routes into the United States allowed the Sinaloa cartel to continue generating vast sums of money, and with it, power. The cartel's vast profits were funneled into a myriad of activities: money laundering, arms smuggling, and even investments in legitimate businesses. The Sinaloa cartel was no longer just a criminal organization, it was a multifaceted enterprise, with influence that reached far beyond the drug trade. Yet, as his empire grew, so did the dangers that came with it. The more powerful El Chapo became, the more he attracted the attention of both enemies and allies. His grip on power was constantly being tested, and the line between friend and foe became increasingly difficult to distinguish. For El Chapo, the stakes were always high. In a world where betrayal was common and enemies lurked in every corner, there was no such thing as safety. His closest allies, the men who helped build his empire, were just as likely to turn on him as they were to support him. The cartel world was a constant game of cat and mouse, and El Chapo played it like a seasoned professional. Despite his best efforts to maintain control, the tensions within his organization were rising. El Chapo's paranoia began to take its toll. His need for absolute loyalty led to purges within the cartel, as he sought to eliminate any potential threats to his power. In the world of organized crime, betrayal was a cardinal sin, and El Chapo's response was swift and violent. Those who crossed him were often dealt with in the harshest of ways, either through execution or by being exiled from the organization. This climate of fear and mistrust created a culture of silence, where no one dared question El Chapo's authority. But as much as El Chapo tried to control his empire, he couldn't escape the reality of the world he lived in. The more he built, the more he risked losing. His vast wealth and power were always precarious, and every move he made had consequences. The tension between expanding his empire and maintaining his position at the top of the cartel was constantly on his mind. He had become a master of the game, but the rules were changing, and El Chapo was starting to realize that even he couldn't control everything. The Mexican government, with the assistance of U.S. authorities, was becoming more aggressive in its efforts to dismantle the cartel. While El Chapo had managed to evade capture time and time again, the pressure was mounting. His rivals were gaining ground, and the cartels were engaging in increasingly violent clashes. The situation was becoming untenable, and El Chapo knew that the end could be near. The empire he had built was under siege, and the consequences of failure were unimaginable. Yet even as the walls began to close in, El Chapo refused to surrender. He had always believed that he could outwit his enemies, and he was willing to do whatever it took to hold on to his empire. The question, however, was whether he would be able to escape the mounting pressure from all sides, or whether his time at the top was finally coming to an end. In the years following his second capture, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's legend had evolved from that of a ruthless drug lord to something far greater, a symbol of defiance, resilience, and the mythical ability to evade capture. His story was no longer just that of a criminal mastermind, it had transformed into a saga of near-mythical proportions, an epic tale of a man who could seemingly escape the grasp of the law at will. But his latest escape was a reminder that, no matter how powerful or untouchable one might feel, the consequences of living a life in constant pursuit of power eventually catch up to you. Captured in 2016 after his daring prison escape, El Chapo was sent to the United States, where the authorities had long sought to bring him to justice. For decades, they had been chasing him, but each time, he managed to slip through their fingers. Now, in the U.S., El Chapo faced a different kind of trial. He wasn't just on trial for the drugs he trafficked or the lives he had taken. He was on trial for everything that he represented, a system of power that had corrupted governments, destroyed communities, and turned entire regions of the world into war zones. He wasn't just being prosecuted for his crimes, he was being prosecuted for his very existence as a living embodiment of everything that was wrong with the drug trade. The trial, which began in late 2018, was a spectacle, drawing worldwide attention. The courtroom, located in Brooklyn, New York, became the stage for a drama that was as much about El Chapo's larger-than-life persona as it was about the details of his criminal empire. The prosecution presented evidence that painted a chilling picture of his reign over the Sinaloa cartel, the tens of billions of dollars in drug sales, the thousands of deaths attributed to his cartel, the vast networks of corruption that had ensured his safety and success. El Chapo's name became synonymous with the darkest aspects of the drug trade, the violence, the bloodshed, and the corruption that seeped into every corner of society. But despite the overwhelming evidence against him, the trial was also a showcase of just how elusive El Chapo had been, how he had turned the criminal underworld into a carefully orchestrated empire. Throughout the trial, El Chapo sat silently, listening as witnesses, many of whom had once worked for him, testified against him. These witnesses revealed the staggering scale of the cartel's operations, the brutality with which El Chapo ruled, and the astonishing lengths to which he went to avoid capture. The most damning testimony came from former associates who described the cartel's methods for smuggling drugs across borders, the bribes paid to law enforcement officers, and the deadly violence that was meted out to anyone who dared to betray El Chapo's trust. But for all the stories of bloodshed and brutality, there was one thing that stood out: El Chapo's unshakable focus on the survival of his empire. He had, in many ways, built an empire that was as complex as it was ruthless, a global network that spanned continents, a business that operated with the precision of a multinational corporation, all while evading the efforts of law enforcement. For El Chapo, the trial was less about defending himself against the charges than it was about maintaining his mystique. He had spent a lifetime cultivating the image of an untouchable figure, someone who could not be brought down by the system, by law enforcement, or even by his rivals. To admit guilt or show remorse would have shattered that image, and so he maintained his stoic demeanor throughout the proceedings. Even when witnesses recounted the horrors of the cartel's operations, El Chapo's face remained impassive. His silence spoke volumes. It was a reflection of the man who had spent his entire life hiding in the shadows, always a step ahead of those who sought to bring him down. The defense, on the other hand, was a different matter. They attempted to discredit the testimonies of the witnesses, painting them as unreliable or motivated by self-interest. They argued that El Chapo was merely a pawn in a much larger game, a figurehead who had been elevated to power by forces beyond his control. They sought to distance him from the atrocities committed by his cartel, but it was a losing battle. The evidence was too overwhelming, and the scope of the cartel's operations was too vast. El Chapo's defense couldn't change the fact that he had built the empire, had masterminded its operations, and had done so with a ruthlessness that was unmatched in the world of organized crime. As the trial went on, it became clear that El Chapo was not just a man on trial for his crimes, he was a symbol of a larger, more systemic problem. The trial wasn't just about one man, it was about an entire network of corruption and violence that had infiltrated the very fabric of Mexican society, and had spread its reach across borders. It was about the massive profits generated by the drug trade and the devastation it caused to communities across Mexico, the United States, and beyond. It was about the cartel culture that had taken root in the world of organized crime, a culture built on fear, loyalty, and bloodshed. El Chapo was the living embodiment of this system. He had created it, maintained it, and profited from it. But there was another layer to the story of how El Chapo's downfall was not just the result of law enforcement efforts, but the result of the very system he had built. The cartel, once the most powerful criminal organization in Mexico, had become a fractured entity, torn apart by infighting, betrayal, and rivalries. El Chapo's own rise to power had been facilitated by the chaos of the drug wars, but as his empire grew, so did the number of enemies. Rival cartels, some of them once allies, now sought to tear down the Sinaloa cartel, and in doing so, they exposed the cracks in El Chapo's organization. His failure to manage these rising threats, combined with the pressure from law enforcement, contributed to the unraveling of his empire. As the trial reached its conclusion in 2019, El Chapo was convicted on all charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and involvement in organized crime. The verdict sent shockwaves through the world. El Chapo, the man who had once been untouchable, had finally been brought to justice. He was sentenced to life in prison, plus 30 years for the murders committed under his orders. His sentencing marked the end of an era, not just for the Sinaloa cartel, but for the world of drug trafficking as a whole. El Chapo had been the face of the global drug trade, and now he was being confined to a U.S. federal prison, his power stripped away, his empire dismantled. The question, of course, remained, what would happen next? Would his capture and conviction lead to the downfall of the Sinaloa cartel, or would it simply create a power vacuum, allowing other factions to rise in his place? In the aftermath of El Chapo's conviction, the drug trade in Mexico continued to thrive, and while his cartel had weakened, it still existed. But El Chapo's absence from the scene marked a shift in the world of organized crime. For those who had followed his story, his conviction was not just the end of one chapter, it was a turning point in the larger war on drugs, a moment that would echo across the criminal underworld for years to come. But as with many criminal legends, El Chapo's story didn't end with his conviction. His name continued to resonate in the streets of Mexico, in the shadowy corners of the drug trade, and in the lives of those who had once served him. The myth of El Chapo was far from dead, and his legacy would live on, not just as a reminder of his rise and fall, but as a symbol of the complex, brutal, and ever-evolving world of the global drug trade. The conviction of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman in 2019 was not just the end of a long, drawn-out trial. It was the final chapter in a decades-long story of a man who had become synonymous with power, cunning, and the dark allure of the cartel world. For years, El Chapo had eluded capture through a combination of strategy, fear, and the loyalty of those around him. Yet, despite his legendary status as a master of evasion, the end came in the form of an elaborate trial, a conviction, and a life sentence that no amount of planning could prevent. But the question that loomed after his conviction was inevitable: what would the world of drug trafficking look like without El Chapo? His story, one of rise, rule, and eventual downfall, was so deeply entrenched in the global drug trade that his absence seemed almost unimaginable. He had built a cartel that was not just a criminal organization, but an empire. His influence had reached the highest levels of power in Mexico, and the ramifications of his conviction sent shockwaves throughout the world, from the streets of Mexico to the back alleys of major American cities. El Chapo's legacy, for better or worse, would live on in the aftershocks of his empire's collapse. In the days following his conviction, there was a sense of finality in the air, but also a lurking question: had El Chapo truly been defeated, or was he simply a symbol of a much larger, more insidious problem? The Sinaloa cartel, which he had once dominated, did not simply evaporate with his arrest. While the cartel's leadership had been fractured, and the organization had certainly lost some of its centralized control, the drug trade had proven to be far more resilient than anyone anticipated. The infrastructure that El Chapo had built was vast and complex, stretching across continents, weaving through international borders, and penetrating the very systems that were supposed to stop it. The vacuum left by his absence was quickly filled by new players, some with direct ties to his organization, and others who sought to capitalize on the chaos. But even as the Sinaloa cartel continued to operate, its once unified leadership had become fragmented. The cartels in Mexico, once tightly controlled by charismatic leaders like El Chapo, were now embroiled in a brutal battle for dominance. His sons, the so-called Chapitos, became the focus of law enforcement's attention, as they sought to maintain their family's grip on the cartel. However, the internecine wars that followed were nothing short of devastating. The power struggle between rival factions within the Sinaloa cartel resulted in widespread violence, even as law enforcement agencies doubled down on their efforts to dismantle what was left of the empire. In many ways, El Chapo's conviction marked the end of an era. The global drug trade, which had been dominated by cartels like Sinaloa, Medellin, and Cali, was undergoing a shift. The traditional hierarchies that once defined these criminal organizations were no longer as relevant in the face of changing times. While the cartels remained powerful, the advent of new technologies, the changing global political landscape, and the increasing cooperation between international law enforcement agencies were changing the rules of the game. The days of cartel bosses like El Chapo, who could control entire regions with a combination of violence, corruption, and strategic alliances, were beginning to fade. But El Chapo's legacy wasn't confined to the immediate fallout of his conviction. It went far beyond the borders of Mexico and the criminal underworld. His life had captured the imagination of the world. The story of his rise from humble beginnings to the leader of one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the planet became a modern-day myth, a story of ambition, survival, and the lure of power. His escapes, his ruthless control over his cartel, and his ability to outwit law enforcement time and time again had elevated him to a level of fame that few criminals ever achieve. Documentaries, books, and even songs were created about his life. His name became a symbol of the extreme lengths to which people would go to in their pursuit of power and wealth. He was both reviled and revered, depending on who you asked. To some, he was the embodiment of the fight against a corrupt system; to others, he was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the drug trade. In the years following his conviction, El Chapo's name continued to echo through the streets of Mexico and the halls of power across the globe. His story was no longer just about drugs, it was about something far deeper, the ability of one man to rise from nothing and shape the world around him. But the reality of his downfall was far more sobering. Despite his legendary status, El Chapo was ultimately a victim of the very system he had helped create. His conviction marked the culmination of years of international efforts to bring him to justice. Yet, as his empire crumbled, it became clear that the drug trade would continue to thrive in some form. El Chapo's demise was only one chapter in a much larger, ongoing story, one that involved not just him, but the countless others who had profited from the drug trade, the politicians and law enforcement officials who had been corrupted, and the communities that had been destroyed in the process. For many, the end of El Chapo's reign was a moment of victory, a sign that the law had triumphed over one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. But for others, it was a reminder that the battle against the drug trade was far from over. The loss of one cartel leader did not equate to the dismantling of the system that had allowed him to rise to power. The drugs, the violence, and the corruption would continue, albeit in a new form. In the aftermath of his conviction, El Chapo's life and legacy continued to loom large. The Sinaloa cartel, while weakened, remained a powerful force in the drug trade. His children, who had been groomed to take over the cartel, stepped into the role of leaders, though they lacked the charismatic influence their father had wielded. And the wider world of organized crime adapted to the changing landscape, as new players emerged to fill the void left by El Chapo's absence. The lessons of his rise and fall were not lost on anyone in the world of drugs and violence. His ability to create a global empire from nothing, his skill in navigating the complexities of cartel politics, and his unrelenting drive for power all served as a blueprint for future generations of criminals. Yet, for all of El Chapo's power and influence, his ultimate fate was a stark reminder of the impermanence of it all. The empire he built was vast, but it was not invincible. The cartels he left behind were fractured, and the world he had created was in turmoil. For all his cunning and ruthless determination, he could not escape the inevitable collapse of his own empire. It was a sobering truth for those who sought to follow in his footsteps: no matter how high you rise, the fall is always waiting. And as the years pass, the story of Joaquin Guzman Lora, the man who built an empire on blood and drugs, continues to be told, both as a cautionary tale and as a symbol of the relentless pursuit of power. In the end, El Chapo's legacy is one that will continue to haunt the criminal underworld, serving as a reminder that the price of power is often higher than anyone can imagine. As Joaquin El Chapo Guzman sat in his prison cell, his mind was constantly at work, replaying the events of his past and contemplating the future of his empire. The world had changed since his rise to power in the 1980s, but the rules of the game had remained the same: survival was the ultimate goal, and power was the currency that bought it. Even behind bars, El Chapo's reach stretched far beyond the confines of his prison. His influence remained intact through his loyal network of allies, his sons, and the vast infrastructure of the Sinaloa cartel that he had built over the years. But as much as he could maintain control from a distance, He knew that his absence would create a void, a vacuum that would eventually lead to a struggle for power within the cartel. The question that lingered in his mind was whether his empire could survive without him at the helm, or whether the cracks that had formed during his absence would widen, threatening to tear everything apart. The Sinaloa cartel, like many other criminal organizations, was founded on loyalty, but loyalty in the world of organized crime was a fragile thing. It was often based on fear and mutual interest, and in the case of El Chapo, it was no different. His leadership had been defined by his ability to control and manipulate, using both rewards and punishments to keep his subordinates in line. But with him behind bars, the dynamics of the cartel began to shift. His sons, who had been groomed to take over the reins of power, were thrust into the spotlight. While many of the cartel's lieutenants had once viewed them with skepticism, they now had no choice but to accept them as the new leaders. The transition of power, however, was far from smooth. El Chapo had long been known for his ability to maintain a delicate balance within the cartel. He kept rival factions in check, ensured that loyalty was rewarded, and dealt with threats to his authority swiftly and ruthlessly. His leadership style was not one of diplomacy but of domination, and it had served him well. But with him out of the picture, the power struggles within the cartel became inevitable. There were those who believed that the Sinaloa cartel could not be led by someone so young, so untested. There were others who saw the sons of El Chapo as mere figureheads, puppets whose strings were being pulled by others with more experience and cunning. The question was not just who would rise to power, but how they would do so. Would it be through violence, manipulation, or a mixture of both? In the weeks and months following El Chapo's conviction and transfer to a U.S. prison, a series of violent incidents began to unfold. Rival factions within the Sinaloa cartel began to fight for control of key territories, smuggling routes, and distribution networks. The violence that had been a hallmark of cartel life under El Chapo's rule only intensified as the power vacuum widened. The battle for supremacy within the Sinaloa cartel became a bloody war, with no clear victor in sight. As gunmen clashed in the streets and blood stained the desert landscape, it became clear that El Chapo's departure had left the cartel vulnerable, despite its size and wealth. The situation only worsened as the authorities, both in Mexico and the United States, began to tighten the noose around the cartel's operations. With El Chapo behind bars, law enforcement agencies took the opportunity to launch a series of raids, seizing shipments of drugs and capturing cartel members who had once been untouchable. The collapse of El Chapo's empire had far-reaching consequences, and the Sinaloa cartel's operations were being systematically dismantled. Yet, despite the heavy losses, the cartel refused to go quietly into the night. El Chapo had always been a master of survival, and his cartel was no different. The resilience of the organization he had built was on full display as it adapted to the changing landscape. Even without its leader at the helm, the cartel was far from dead. New leaders emerged from within the ranks, many of them men who had worked for El Chapo and understood the intricacies of the cartel's operations. They were no strangers to the game of survival, and they knew how to keep the flow of drugs moving, even as the authorities closed in. But as the cartel adapted to its new leadership, it also faced new challenges. The global drug trade was becoming more complex, more fragmented. While cartels like Sinaloa had once dominated the market, new players were emerging. In the wake of El Chapo's conviction, other organizations began to capitalize on the opportunities presented by the power vacuum. Cartels from other parts of Mexico, like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, began to expand their reach, challenging Sinaloa's dominance in regions it had once controlled. The rise of these new players further exacerbated the violence in Mexico, as rival factions fought for control of the lucrative drug trade. Despite these challenges, El Chapo's legacy endured. His name remained a symbol of the cartel's power and resilience, and his sons, while struggling to maintain control, continued to operate in his shadow. Even as law enforcement agencies across the world worked tirelessly to dismantle his cartel, the myth of El Chapo lived on. His story was far from over, and his influence continued to be felt, even in the most remote corners of the drug trade. The question, however, remained, would his empire survive without him? Would his sons be able to maintain the same level of control, or would the forces that had once aided El Chapo in his rise to power ultimately destroy the very empire he had built? The reality of El Chapo's legacy was a complex one. On one hand, his influence was undeniable. His cartel had become a multi-billion-dollar empire that spanned continents, and his methods of smuggling, laundering money, and bribing officials had set the standard for criminal organizations worldwide. On the other hand, his downfall had exposed the vulnerabilities of the cartel world. The very system that had allowed El Chapo to rise to power, the system of bribery, manipulation, and violence, had proven to be fragile. With his capture and conviction, the Sinaloa cartel had lost its most important asset, its leader. And in a world where leadership was everything, the absence of El Chapo left a dangerous void. While El Chapo's empire may have been fractured, the lessons of his rise and fall remained relevant. The cartel world had changed, but it was still driven by the same ruthless principles that had allowed El Chapo to rise from humble beginnings to become one of the most powerful men in the world. The battle for power continued, and in the shadow of his downfall, new players emerged, eager to fill the void left by his absence. For El Chapo's children, the path forward was uncertain. They inherited not just the wealth and power of the cartel, but the dangers that came with it. Their father's enemies, both old and new, were ready to strike. The Sinaloa cartel's power may have been fractured, but its influence had not vanished. And as long as the global demand for drugs remained, the battle for control of the drug trade would continue, with or without El Chapo at the helm. In the end, El Chapo's story was one of paradoxes. His rise to power had been fueled by violence, corruption, and ruthlessness, yet his fall had been caused by the very same forces. He had built an empire that spanned the globe, but in the end, it was his empire that betrayed him. The legacy of Joaquin Guzman Lora was one that would be felt for generations to come, a reminder of the dangerous allure of power, the price of betrayal, and the fragility of even the most invincible-looking empires. His name would live on in the history of organized crime, a symbol of both triumph and tragedy, and the complex, ever-evolving nature of the drug trade. Even behind bars, Joaquin, El Chapo, Guzman remained one of the most influential figures in the world of organized crime. His name echoed in the shadows of the drug trade, a symbol of both the heights of power and the inevitable downfall that came with it. His arrest in 2016, the second time after his dramatic prison escape, had rocked the very foundations of the Sinaloa cartel. Yet, despite being locked away in a maximum security prison in the United States, the legacy of his reign over one of the world's largest drug trafficking organizations refused to fade. The reach of his cartel extended far beyond what anyone had imagined, and even as authorities tightened their grip on his empire, the story of El Chapo was far from over. The criminal network that El Chapo had built wasn't just a business, it was an intricate web of loyalty, fear, and influence. For decades, Guzman had been a shadow ruler, a figure who controlled the lives of thousands through his drug empire. Under his command, the Sinaloa cartel had grown from a relatively small operation into a vast, international network that spanned countries, continents, and entire industries. From his vast network of smuggling routes that stretched through Mexico and into the United States to his influence over corrupt officials and law enforcement, El Chapo's power was as widespread as it was deeply entrenched. Even as the government cracked down on his cartel, his empire had become so resilient that it could survive without him, or so many believed. But the question that everyone in the underworld and law enforcement was asking was simple: who would take over now that El Chapo was gone? The immediate answer seemed to lie with his sons, the so-called Chapitos. Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, and Ovidio Guzman were all in the process of being groomed for leadership roles within the cartel, but their inexperience and youth made some skeptical of their ability to carry the weight of the Sinaloa cartel. Unlike their father, who had built the empire from the ground up, the Chapitos were born into it. While they may have inherited his wealth and power, they lacked the street-level experience and the intricate understanding of cartel politics that had made El Chapo such a formidable figure. But the truth was that El Chapo's influence was not solely dependent on his bloodline. He had surrounded himself with a loyal network of lieutenants, advisors, and enforcers who had helped him build his empire. These men had been critical to the cartel's operations and had played pivotal roles in the day-to-day management of the business. Some of them were former military men, others seasoned criminals with years of experience in the drug trade. Their loyalty to El Chapo was unquestionable, and many of them viewed his sons as inexperienced and unworthy of inheriting the full weight of the cartel's leadership. As a result, the battle for control over the Sinaloa cartel was anything but settled. The power vacuum that followed El Chapo's imprisonment ignited a series of violent conflicts within the cartel. Various factions began to vie for control of the lucrative drug routes, the trafficking operations, and the vast profits that came with them. The Chapitos, despite their inherited power, were unable to assert total control over the cartel, and soon they were faced with challenges from both rival factions within their own organization and rival cartels. As the violence intensified, the once unified cartel began to fracture, and the bloodshed that had characterized El Chapo's rule escalated. While the Chapitos struggled to maintain their grip on the cartel, a new generation of criminal leaders was emerging. Among them was Ismael El Mayo Zambada, a longtime associate of El Chapo who had been instrumental in building the Sinaloa cartel's operations. Zambada, a quiet and calculating figure, had long been the muscle behind the cartel's operations, handling many of the logistical aspects that kept the empire running smoothly. Unlike El Chapo, who was known for his charisma and larger-than-life persona, El Mayo preferred to stay in the background, pulling strings without drawing attention to himself. Zambada was one of the most powerful figures in the cartel, and his experience made him a key player in the struggle for control. He had survived the rise and fall of countless rivals and had outlasted the best efforts of law enforcement to bring him down. If anyone could fill the void left by El Chapo, it was El Mayo. However, his style of leadership was different from that of El Chapo. While Guzman had relied on fear, charisma, and violence to maintain control, Zambada was more subtle, preferring to negotiate, broker deals, and use his vast network of contacts to achieve his goals. But as the battle for control of the cartel raged on, it wasn't just the sons or the lieutenants who were affected. The Sinaloa cartel's ability to continue operating in the wake of El Chapo's imprisonment was a testament to the deep roots the organization had planted in both the criminal world and the legitimate economy. The cartel's reach extended far beyond just drugs. It had its hands in everything from money laundering and weapons trafficking to human smuggling and even legitimate businesses. El Chapo had always understood that a successful criminal empire needed to diversify, and he had ensured that the Sinaloa cartel did just that. But this diversification also meant that the cartel's collapse would not come easily. The federal government in Mexico, as well as U.S. authorities, were fully aware of the potential for the cartel to reorganize itself, and they were already taking steps to ensure that El Chapo's absence did not go unchallenged. The war on drugs, which had taken a heavy toll on both sides of the border, was about to enter a new phase. Even with the capture of El Chapo, the fight against the Sinaloa cartel remained a massive undertaking. His arrest and conviction were seen by many as a victory, but for the law enforcement agencies involved, it was just one battle in a much larger war. The fear of the Sinaloa cartel's resurgence was not unfounded. After all, El Chapo's ability to evade capture had shown just how adaptable the cartel could be. Even from prison, he was still able to communicate with his associates, direct operations, and even plan his own escapes. His network of loyalists remained intact, and despite being incarcerated, El Chapo's name continued to inspire fear among both his allies and enemies. His legacy, in many ways, had become more powerful after his imprisonment, as the myth of his invincibility grew. In the aftermath of his conviction, it became clear that El Chapo had not been the only one to benefit from his cartel. His empire had helped countless others climb the ranks of the criminal world. It had created a global network of drug dealers, arms traffickers, and money launderers who owed their success to the Sinaloa cartel. Even after his capture, these figures continued to operate with the resources and power that El Chapo had provided them. The cartel's influence, it seemed, was unstoppable. But the question remained, Would it continue to thrive in a world without its legendary leader? The answer to that question wasn't clear yet. While the Chapitos and El Mayo Zambada fought to assert control, other cartels in Mexico were quickly moving in to fill the void. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, which had grown in prominence during El Chapo's reign, was one of the biggest threats to the Sinaloa cartel. It was led by Nemesio, El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes, a ruthless figure who had taken full advantage of El Chapo's absence to expand his operations. The violence between the two cartels escalated, and the Mexican government found itself grappling with an unprecedented level of cartel warfare. While the Sinaloa cartel was far from defeated, the shifting balance of power in the cartel world was becoming increasingly apparent. For El Chapo, the legacy of his empire was both a blessing and a curse. His influence had extended far beyond his time and power, but as the world around him changed, so too did the landscape of the criminal underworld. And though his name remained synonymous with the world's most powerful drug trafficking organization, the future of the Sinaloa cartel was uncertain. Would it adapt to the new world without him, or would the forces that had once made it so powerful lead to its eventual decline? In the years following El Chapo's conviction, the Sinaloa cartel continued to adapt and evolve, but its structure had been irreparably shaken. The seismic shift caused by his absence had rippled across the global drug trade, but whether it would lead to the cartel's ultimate demise or a reinvention of its operations remained uncertain. The cartel was not just a drug trafficking organization, it was an intricate network built over decades, woven through the fabric of Mexican society and beyond. Even in El Chapo's absence, the Sinaloa cartel remained a powerful force, its shadow still looming over the world's illicit trade. But the cartel's survival would depend on a new set of leaders who would have to navigate the treacherous waters of power struggles, rivalries, and shifting alliances in a world that was increasingly hostile to their operations. The immediate aftermath of El Chapo's conviction saw a growing battle for control over the Sinaloa cartel. The Chapitos, his sons, were seen as the natural successors to his throne, but their inexperience and lack of the street-level authority their father had wielded created cracks in their leadership. Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, and Ovidio Guzman had been raised in the lap of the cartel's wealth and power, but they were not as seasoned as their father had been. While they had the advantage of bloodline and access to vast resources, they lacked the raw cunning and ruthlessness that had defined El Chapo's reign. For many in the cartel, the notion of having a generational handover to El Chapo's sons seemed too idealistic. Power in the world of drug cartels was earned through loyalty, brutality, and an ability to manipulate the law and rival factions. The reality was far more complex. While the Chapitos certainly had their own loyal supporters, their ability to command the respect that their father had earned over decades was in question. For El Chapo's cartel to continue its dominance, someone needed to step up with the same level of ruthlessness and cunning that had been the hallmark of El Chapo himself. This void led to a power struggle not just between the Chapitos and their father's old allies, but also between rival factions within the cartel. Those who had once served under El Chapo, men like Ismael, El Mayo, Zambada, began to make their moves, positioning themselves as key players in the post-El Chapo era. Zambada, a seasoned cartel leader who had long operated behind the scenes, was one of the few figures who could challenge the Guzman family for control. While El Chapo had been the face of the Sinaloa cartel, Zambada had been its operational brain. He had overseen much of the cartel's logistics, overseeing shipments, managing contacts, and keeping things running smoothly while El Chapo took the lead on violent confrontations and public image. Zambada's understated, low-key approach had kept him under the radar of law enforcement for years. He had outlasted many other figures in the cartel world, remaining untouchable despite decades of pressure. While El Chapo was often regarded as the more charismatic leader, Zambada was pragmatic, using negotiation, strategy, and subtle influence to maintain his power. In the absence of El Chapo, Zambada had the skills and experience necessary to step into a larger leadership role, but his leadership would come with its own set of challenges. As the battle for control raged within the cartel, the external pressures from law enforcement grew even stronger. Both the Mexican and U.S. governments had invested heavily in dismantling the Sinaloa cartel, and El Chapo's arrest had been a significant victory for them. However, the sense of triumph quickly turned to realization: the cartel was not simply going to disappear with the arrest of one man. The Sinaloa cartel was an institution, an empire that had been built through years of corruption, violence, and strategic maneuvering. In the world of organized crime, empires didn't crumble with the fall of one leader, they evolved, often in ways that were more dangerous and more resilient than before. In the months following El Chapo's sentencing, U.S. authorities ramped up their efforts to target the cartel's financial infrastructure. The U.S. government had long viewed the Sinaloa cartel as one of the most formidable threats to public safety, and El Chapo's conviction was seen as the start of a wider strategy to decimate the organization. One of the cartel's greatest strengths had been its ability to launder massive amounts of money through legitimate businesses. The networks that had allowed the cartel to funnel billions of dollars were still intact, and both Mexican and U.S. authorities knew that taking down these financial networks was just as important as capturing cartel leaders. While El Chapo's absence created an opportunity for law enforcement, the cartel's ability to adapt and regenerate meant that the real battle was just beginning. But the rise of rival cartels, particularly the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, began to complicate things further. The CJNG, led by Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes, was fast becoming one of the most violent and influential criminal organizations in Mexico. Unlike the Sinaloa cartel, which had historically relied on its extensive network and international reach, the CJNG was built on raw violence and intimidation. Their expansion into territories once controlled by the Sinaloa cartel was not just a business move, it was an attempt to assert dominance through sheer force. El Mencho's cartel was rapidly becoming one of the most dangerous groups in the world, and the rise of the CJNG posed a serious threat to the stability of the Sinaloa cartel's operations. As the CJNG clashed with the remnants of El Chapo's empire, violence spiraled out of control. Battles between the two cartels raged in the streets of cities and towns across Mexico, with innocent civilians often caught in the crossfire. The brutal war between the CJNG and the Sinaloa cartel represented a new phase in the ongoing battle for control of the drug trade. The old guard, represented by figures like El Mayo, fought to maintain control, while new, more violent forces, like El Mencho, sought to overtake them. For the Guzman family, the situation had become even more precarious. Their empire was crumbling under the weight of internal strife, external threats, and the relentless pursuit of law enforcement. The Chapitos, who had once been the heirs to a criminal dynasty, now found themselves embroiled in a conflict that threatened to engulf them. The war between the Sinaloa cartel and the CJNG was not just a battle for territory, it was a battle for survival. As the Chapitos attempted to assert their authority, they faced the harsh reality that they would have to fight not only rival cartels but also factions within their own organization. The story of El Chapo had always been one of strategic dominance and violent control, but his sons were quickly learning that leadership in the world of organized crime required far more than just bloodline and inherited wealth. As law enforcement agencies in Mexico and the United States tightened their grip, it became evident that the Sinaloa cartel's future was uncertain. The rise of new players, both within the cartel and in the broader criminal landscape, meant that the Sinaloa cartel's dominance was being tested in ways it never had before. The violence that had defined the cartel's operations for years had only escalated, and the world was beginning to see just how fragile the empire really was. The war for control, both internally and externally, highlighted the core of El Chapo's legacy. His empire had been built on the backs of violence, loyalty, and fear, but it had also been sustained by a system of power that relied on adaptability. The fall of El Chapo was not the end of the Sinaloa cartel, rather, it marked the beginning of a new era. Whether that era would be defined by the Guzman family or by their rivals was still up in the air, but one thing was certain, the cartel's story was far from finished. The question remained, could the Sinaloa cartel survive without its legendary leader, or would it fall victim to the chaos and violence that had plagued it from the very beginning? As the violence and power struggles within the Sinaloa cartel escalated in the aftermath of El Chapo's conviction, another force began to make itself known: the United States government. While El Chapo's arrest had been seen as a victory for law enforcement, the real challenge had just begun. The Sinaloa cartel had built an empire that was not just centered in Mexico but spanned across continents, its influence felt in the streets of America, Europe, and beyond. And now, with El Chapo behind bars, the world was watching to see if the United States, with its vast intelligence networks and law enforcement resources, could dismantle the cartel once and for all. The drug trade had long been a thorn in the side of U.S. authorities. The Sinaloa cartel was one of the largest suppliers of narcotics to the United States, trafficking in everything from cocaine and heroin to methamphetamines and fentanyl. For years, the cartel had controlled the flow of these drugs into American cities, where they were sold on the streets and in neighborhoods, fueling addiction, violence, and despair. The U.S. government had invested billions in fighting the war on drugs, but the Sinaloa cartel remained elusive. El Chapo's capture was a significant blow to the cartel, but it was only one battle in a much larger war. In the wake of El Chapo's conviction, U.S. authorities were quick to shift their focus from the figurehead of the cartel to the network that had supported him for so many years. The cartel had been built on a foundation of money laundering, bribery, and corruption, tools that El Chapo had used to keep his empire running smoothly. But now that the face of the cartel was gone, law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border turned their attention to the operations that kept the cartel financially afloat. The question that haunted them was simple: could they take down the Sinaloa cartel without ever truly capturing its heart? The infrastructure that El Chapo had built over decades was formidable. It was not just about smuggling drugs across the border. It was about controlling entire regions, manipulating markets, and gaining influence over law enforcement and political institutions. The Sinaloa cartel had its hands in virtually every aspect of Mexico's economy, from legitimate businesses to the underworld of criminal activity. El Chapo's network was vast, and his ability to control it from behind bars only proved how resilient the cartel had become. The United States, in its pursuit of justice, began targeting the cartel's financial empire. Money laundering, a key part of the cartel's operations, was a critical focus. The Sinaloa cartel had established an extensive network of front companies, shell corporations, and international banking connections that allowed them to move massive amounts of money across borders. In the past, El Chapo had used a combination of corruption and intimidation to ensure that his transactions went unnoticed by authorities. But with his capture, the spotlight was now on those who had helped facilitate his empire's wealth. The U.S. government worked tirelessly to track down these financial conduits, seizing assets, freezing accounts, and shutting down businesses that had been used to launder drug money. One of the greatest challenges facing U.S. authorities was the sheer scale of the Sinaloa cartel's operations. The cartel had established an intricate system of drug trafficking that spanned multiple countries, and its connections in the United States were particularly strong. The cartel's distribution network was vast, and it had infiltrated nearly every level of society. From street-level dealers to high-ranking politicians and law enforcement officers, the Sinaloa cartel had managed to exert influence over virtually every sector of life in both Mexico and the United States. It was this level of control that had allowed El Chapo to operate with such impunity for so long. The cartel wasn't just a criminal organization, it was a shadow government, with its own set of rules, codes, and operations. As the U.S. government continued its crackdown, the cartels that had once been rival organizations were now forming alliances of convenience. The fall of El Chapo had sent shockwaves through the world of organized crime, and the Sinaloa cartel's rivals saw an opportunity to strike. New players began to emerge in the power vacuum, some from Mexico and others from beyond. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, quickly expanded its reach, taking advantage of the chaos caused by the power struggle within the Sinaloa cartel. While El Chapo's empire was far from collapsing, it was undeniably weakened, and the CJNG was ready to capitalize on that weakness. The rise of the CJNG brought a new level of violence to the streets of Mexico. While El Chapo had been ruthless in his approach to maintaining power, the CJNG was even more violent, often resorting to extreme tactics in their battle for dominance. Their brutal methods, including the use of car bombs and beheadings, created an environment of terror in the cities where they operated. The CJNG's goal was simple: take over the territories once controlled by the Sinaloa cartel and eliminate any rival factions, including El Chapo's loyalists. The cartel war between the Sinaloa cartel and the CJNG escalated into an all-out war, with civilians, law enforcement, and criminals all caught in the crossfire. But the rise of the CJNG also forced the Sinaloa cartel to adapt. El Chapo's absence left a leadership vacuum, but that didn't mean the cartel had no chance of survival. Figures like Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who had long been one of El Chapo's closest allies, emerged as a key figure in the cartel's attempt to retain control. Zambada, who had been operating in the shadows for years, was now forced to take on a more visible role. His leadership style was far less flamboyant than El Chapo's, but his influence within the cartel was undeniable. Zambada was the glue that had held the cartel together in El Chapo's absence, and while he was no stranger to violence, his approach was far more calculated and subtle. His ability to broker deals and maintain alliances would prove critical in the coming years as the Sinaloa cartel fought to maintain its dominance in the face of external threats. Despite the efforts of figures like Zambada, the Sinaloa cartel was in a precarious position. El Chapo had been the public face of the organization, and his charisma had attracted followers from all walks of life. His ability to inspire loyalty, even from those who had never met him, had been a key component of his success. Without him, the cartel lacked the unifying force that had once held it together. But as history had shown, criminal organizations were often defined by their ability to survive, even in the face of near-total collapse. The Sinaloa cartel, despite its fractures, was far from finished. The war between the cartels intensified, and the violence that followed was nothing short of devastating. Thousands of lives were lost in the clashes between the Sinaloa cartel and the CJNG. But the most chilling part of this new chapter was the shift in the nature of the conflict. The violence was no longer just about territory or power, it was about survival. The cartels had become locked in a struggle for dominance that would determine not only the future of the drug trade but also the future of Mexico itself. As the violence escalated, the government of Mexico found itself caught in a difficult position. The Mexican state had long struggled with corruption and inefficiency within its law enforcement and military forces, and the rise of the cartels had only deepened the crisis. The government had long relied on military and police forces to combat the drug trade, but these forces were often compromised by cartel influence. Even as the government launched operations to target cartel leaders and dismantle drug trafficking routes, the cartels remained resilient. The power of the Sinaloa cartel, despite the absence of El Chapo, was still formidable, and the competition from the CJNG only intensified the pressure on Mexico's law enforcement. The story of El Chapo, the man who had once seemed invincible, was far from over. His empire had outlived him, and the violence, corruption, and greed that had fueled its rise continued to shape the future of Mexico and the United States. Even from behind bars, El Chapo's influence could still be felt. The world of organized crime had changed in the years since his capture, but the same forces that had propelled him to the top, violence, loyalty, and manipulation, remained as potent as ever. The battle for control of the drug trade, and the future of the Sinaloa cartel, was still very much a work in progress. But one thing was clear, the legend of El Chapo would continue to haunt the world of crime for years to come. Even though Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was behind bars, his name continued to reverberate through the underworld, a symbol of both fear and fascination. The Sinaloa cartel, a massive criminal empire that he had built, had seen its share of trials and tribulations, but it was still standing, despite the loss of its most notorious leader. The battle for control of the cartel had intensified, and now, with the ever-looming presence of the U.S. government and Mexican authorities, the cartel's survival was anything but guaranteed. Yet, it wasn't only the authorities who were seeking to dismantle the empire that El Chapo had built. Rivals, opportunists, and even former allies began to circle like vultures, each hoping to stake a claim on the remnants of what was once the most powerful criminal organization in the world. El Chapo's conviction in 2019 had been a significant blow, but the cartel had always been more than just one man. It was a system, a sprawling network of loyalists, enforcers, money launderers, smugglers, and corrupt officials, all of whom had a vested interest in keeping the operation running. This network was not something that could be easily destroyed. While El Chapo's personal charisma and cunning had been the glue that held the Sinaloa cartel together, his absence didn't spell the end of the organization. If anything, it was a signal to the world that the Sinaloa cartel was not just an empire built on violence and fear, but also on adaptability and resilience. One of the key factors in the cartel's survival was its ability to remain decentralized. Unlike some other criminal organizations that were highly hierarchical, with one individual at the top calling the shots, El Chapo had built a system in which power was spread across various factions. This made it harder for authorities to dismantle the cartel, as there wasn't a single point of failure. Each region, each operation, each drug route had its own leadership. When El Chapo was taken out of the equation, many of his loyal subordinates, including his longtime ally Ismael El Mayo Zambada, were quick to step in and fill the void. Zambada, known for his calculated and low-key approach, had long been one of the most powerful figures in the Sinaloa cartel. While El Chapo had been the face of the organization, Zambada had been the mind behind much of its day-to-day operations. His ability to work in the shadows, avoiding the limelight and staying out of the public eye, had kept him one step ahead of law enforcement. Even as El Chapo's personal empire began to crumble, Zambada's position remained solid. He had the loyalty of the cartel's most trusted operatives, and his vast network of contacts stretched across the globe. However, despite Zambada's expertise and influence, the Sinaloa cartel's ability to maintain its dominance was no longer a given. Rival factions, both within the cartel and from outside, were becoming more aggressive in their efforts to carve out a piece of the drug trade. The rise of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, led by the brutal Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes, posed a direct challenge to the Sinaloa cartel's operations. The CJNG was a newer player on the scene, but its rapid expansion and willingness to use extreme violence to achieve its goals made it a formidable opponent. The cartel's ability to spread terror through Mexico, employing tactics like car bombs and assassinations, was making it difficult for the Sinaloa cartel to maintain control of its former territory. As the battle between the Sinaloa cartel and the CJNG raged on, the violence that had once been contained to certain regions began to spread throughout Mexico. Cities that had once been considered safe havens for the Sinaloa cartel's operations were now embroiled in violent turf wars. Innocent civilians found themselves caught in the crossfire as the two cartels fought for supremacy. The once thriving routes that El Chapo had built, which stretched from the mountains of Sinaloa to the streets of New York and Chicago, were now under constant threat of being taken over by the CJNG. In the midst of this chaos, El Chapo's family, particularly his sons, were thrust into leadership positions. Iván Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, and Ovidio Guzmán were now tasked with keeping the empire intact. Their father's legacy, though a powerful force, was also a burden. The world had watched El Chapo's rise to power, and now it was watching his sons try to fill his shoes. The challenge was immense. While El Chapo had been a master of manipulation, able to control both allies and enemies with ease, his sons were still learning the ropes of the business. Their rise to power wasn't just about inheriting wealth and territory, it was about proving that they had the same cunning and ruthlessness that had defined their father's rule. But as the violence between the cartels escalated, the sons of El Chapo faced more than just the challenges of managing their father's empire. They were also facing pressure from law enforcement, who were increasingly targeting the Guzmán family in an attempt to dismantle the cartel from the inside out. The Mexican government, which had long struggled with cartel violence, was now intensifying its efforts to go after the remaining leaders of the Sinaloa cartel. The U.S. government, with its ever-growing list of charges against the Guzmán family, was also working tirelessly to bring them to justice. In 2019, Ovidio Guzmán, one of El Chapo's sons, was arrested in Culiacan, the heart of Sinaloa. His capture sent shockwaves through the cartel, and in a dramatic turn of events, the Sinaloa cartel retaliated by launching a massive rescue operation. Armed gunmen clashed with Mexican security forces, and the city descended into chaos. The operation to free Ovidio Guzman ended with his release, a stark reminder of the cartel's immense power and influence. While the government had hoped that capturing one of El Chapo's sons would deal a blow to the cartel, the incident only highlighted the resilience of the Sinaloa cartel and its ability to mobilize when threatened. The aftermath of Ovidio's arrest and release also showed how deeply ingrained the Sinaloa cartel was in the fabric of Mexican society. The government's inability to hold on to Ovidio Guzman was a clear signal that the cartel had control over large swaths of the country, not just through violence, but through political influence as well. Corruption within local governments and law enforcement agencies had long been a critical element of the cartel's operations, and the public release of Ovidio Guzman only reinforced the idea that the Sinaloa cartel had a near-iron grip on the region. This event also marked a turning point in the cartel's internal dynamics. While El Chapo's sons were attempting to assert control, it was clear that their leadership was not without its challenges. Their authority was being constantly questioned, both by rival cartels and by factions within their own organization. As the violence escalated, the once unified Sinaloa cartel began to fracture into different factions, each vying for power. Some factions, loyal to El Chapo's vision, stuck with his sons, while others saw the shift in leadership as an opportunity to make their own move. But the fight for power wasn't just internal. The CJNG, with its violent tactics and aggressive expansion, was a constant threat. Their attacks were not just about expanding territory, they were about humiliating their rivals and demonstrating their superiority. The Sinaloa cartel, which had built its empire on control, negotiation, and political influence, was being forced into a corner by a cartel that operated with unrestrained violence. The tactics of the CJNG were foreign to the Sinaloa cartel, and it was becoming clear that the cartel would need to adapt if it hoped to survive. The violence between the two cartels reached a fever pitch, and the war for control of the drug trade escalated across Mexico. It was not just about who controlled the drug routes anymore, it was about who could survive the storm. The Sinaloa cartel's days of uncontested dominance were over. With El Chapo gone, his empire was being pulled apart at the seams, and the once invincible organization found itself fighting for its very survival. But the story of El Chapo's empire wasn't over. Even in the face of insurmountable odds, the cartel's resilience and its ability to adapt would continue to be tested in the years to come. The battle for supremacy had only just begun. The Sinaloa cartel's struggle to maintain its dominance following El Chapo's conviction wasn't just about surviving against the violence of rival cartels or the crushing pressure from law enforcement, it was also about the shifting landscape of global drug trade dynamics. The global landscape of the illicit drug market had been evolving rapidly in the years after El Chapo's capture. In addition to the rise of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, a new era of geopolitics and technological advancements had begun to shape the flow of narcotics. It was no longer just about trafficking traditional drugs like cocaine and heroin, it was about adapting to new, synthetic, and increasingly profitable substances that were flooding markets across North America, Europe, and beyond. One of the most significant changes in the drug trade since El Chapo's fall was the rise of fentanyl. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that was originally designed as a painkiller, had quickly gained a notorious reputation for its potency and its ability to be trafficked in small quantities, making it an ideal substance for smugglers looking to evade detection. The drug's deadly potency was its key characteristic. A dose of fentanyl the size of a grain of salt could kill a person. While the Sinaloa cartel had long been a dominant player in the heroin trade, fentanyl presented both an opportunity and a threat. For one, it was much cheaper to produce, and it required far less effort to ship into the United States, making it a lucrative addition to the cartel's portfolio. But fentanyl also brought with it increased scrutiny and risk. While the Sinaloa cartel had always been careful to stay one step ahead of law enforcement, the growing prevalence of fentanyl raised the stakes for everyone involved in the drug trade. The U.S. government, which had long been focused on curbing the heroin trade, now had a new focus: fentanyl. This shift in priorities meant that the Sinaloa cartel's operations were increasingly vulnerable to detection and disruption. The methods of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and Mexican authorities had evolved as well, with new technologies, increased surveillance, and better coordination between agencies, making it harder for smugglers to hide their operations. As the cartel faced mounting pressure from law enforcement, it also had to contend with the evolving nature of the drug market itself. The Sinaloa cartel, despite its deeply entrenched position in the drug trade, was not immune to the winds of change. The cartel's once-iron grip on the heroin market was weakening as fentanyl took center stage. Some of the cartel's leadership, particularly figures like Ismael El Mayo Zambada, had been wary of this shift. Zambada, known for his long-term thinking, understood the dangers of getting involved in the fentanyl trade. While the profits were massive, the risks were equally high. The growing public awareness of fentanyl's deadly effects made it a prime target for law enforcement, and the cartel had to weigh the potential rewards against the danger of becoming the face of America's opioid crisis. But even with Zambada's caution, the demand for fentanyl was too strong to ignore. For the Sinaloa cartel, this meant adapting quickly to the changing tides of the drug trade. Its network of traffickers and producers in Mexico, Colombia, and beyond began to shift their focus to the production and trafficking of synthetic opioids like fentanyl, methamphetamines, and other illicit substances. The traditional drug routes that had been used for cocaine and heroin were repurposed for these new drugs. The flow of fentanyl into the United States, in particular, became a significant part of the cartel's operations. By the mid-2010s, the Sinaloa cartel had become one of the primary players in the fentanyl trade, supplying vast quantities of the drug to distributors in the U.S. While it continued to dominate the heroin market, the cartel's ability to adapt to new drugs ensured its continued relevance. The rise of fentanyl also meant that the Sinaloa cartel faced a new set of enemies, groups and organizations that were looking to corner the fentanyl market for themselves. One of these groups was the Chinese criminal syndicates, who played a critical role in the global fentanyl trade. While the cartel had long relied on its South American connections to source cocaine and heroin, the introduction of fentanyl required a new set of alliances and negotiations. The Chinese criminal syndicates were key players in the production of fentanyl and its precursor chemicals. These syndicates provided the raw materials necessary for the production of synthetic opioids, and they were working directly with Mexican cartels, including Sinaloa, to ensure that the drug made its way into the United States. The Sinaloa cartel, with its vast logistics network and connections across borders, was able to act as the intermediary, moving the fentanyl from China to Mexico and then into the U.S. This new partnership between Mexican cartels and Chinese drug producers was a game-changer for the Sinaloa cartel. It allowed them to tap into a completely new revenue stream, but it also exposed them to increased risk. The U.S. government, already battling an unprecedented opioid crisis, was now focusing its attention on international fentanyl networks. The DEA began targeting Chinese manufacturers and their Mexican partners with increasing urgency. Law enforcement agencies were able to make inroads in disrupting the flow of fentanyl, but the cartel's ability to shift its operations and evolve made it a difficult enemy to combat. Every time authorities took a step forward, the Sinaloa cartel adapted, finding new ways to smuggle the drugs, new places to hide them, and new contacts to exploit. As the cartel adapted to the fentanyl trade, it also began to expand into methamphetamine production. Meth had been a fixture in the illicit drug market for decades, but its popularity surged in the years following El Chapo's conviction. The Sinaloa cartel, recognizing the rising demand for methamphetamine, seized the opportunity to expand its operations into the production and trafficking of this highly addictive drug. Much like fentanyl, methamphetamine could be produced in small, easily concealable quantities, making it ideal for smuggling. And the profits were massive. By the time the cartel had fully integrated meth into its operations, it had become one of the largest producers and distributors of the drug in the United States. The rise of fentanyl, meth, and other synthetic drugs did not eliminate the demand for traditional narcotics like cocaine and heroin, but it did shift the balance of power in the drug trade. The Sinaloa cartel, under the leadership of El Chapo's sons and Zambada, was now operating in a world where the drugs they trafficked were not only highly profitable but also increasingly dangerous. The cartel's ability to diversify and evolve in response to changing drug trends ensured its survival, but it also heightened the risks of getting caught. The U.S. government's war on drugs, especially its focus on fentanyl and synthetic opioids, had become more aggressive and sophisticated, and the pressure on the Sinaloa cartel intensified. The cartel's resilience was now being tested by forces beyond its control. The changing nature of the global drug market was forcing the cartel to make difficult decisions. Should it continue to prioritize traditional drug routes, which were increasingly under threat, or should it embrace the new synthetic drug trade, which came with its own set of dangers? It was a balancing act, one that would determine the future of the cartel for years to come. Even as the cartel grappled with these new challenges, it had to contend with the ever-present threat of law enforcement. The U.S. government, in particular, had made it a priority to target the fentanyl trade. The success of Operation Fast and Furious, a controversial program designed to track illegal gun sales to Mexican cartels, showed the growing coordination between U.S. and Mexican authorities. As technology advanced, surveillance techniques became more sophisticated, and it became increasingly difficult for cartels to operate undetected. Yet, the cartel's ability to innovate and find new ways to smuggle and distribute drugs kept them one step ahead. But with each new development, the game of cat and mouse between the cartel and the authorities grew more complex. In this new era of drug trafficking, the Sinaloa cartel found itself at a crossroads. The next chapter of the cartel's story would be defined by how well it could adapt to the new realities of the global drug market. Would it continue to dominate, or would its reign be cut short by the evolving dynamics of law enforcement, rival cartels, and changing drug trends? The Sinaloa cartel had weathered many storms in its history, but this new era posed the greatest challenge yet. As the Sinaloa cartel continued to fight for its survival in the wake of El Chapo's conviction and amidst the rapidly shifting dynamics of the global drug trade, the U.S. government's efforts to dismantle the cartel were intensifying. The battle between law enforcement and drug cartels had reached a boiling point, with the Sinaloa cartel now facing unprecedented pressure from all sides. The cartel had long been a shadowy organization, operating under the radar of law enforcement, but now, with El Chapo gone and his empire fractured, the cartel was exposed like never before. The Mexican government, while often complicit in the cartel's operations due to deep-rooted corruption, was now faced with increasing international pressure to act. The United States, having already spent billions of dollars in its war on drugs, was pushing for stronger measures to curtail the flow of narcotics and eliminate the cartel's influence. The cartel's ability to remain one step ahead of law enforcement had always been one of its greatest assets. Under El Chapo's reign, the cartel had mastered the art of smuggling drugs across borders with incredible efficiency, using everything from tunnels to submarines to covert airstrips. The infrastructure that El Chapo had built was resilient and adaptable, enabling the cartel to continue operating even when authorities seemed to be closing in. However, with the rise of fentanyl and the changing nature of the global drug market, the challenges facing the cartel had become more complex than ever. It was no longer just about cocaine and heroin, it was about synthetic opioids, methamphetamines, and an ever-growing range of illicit substances that were flooding the streets of America and beyond. These new drugs brought with them new risks, and the U.S. government had made it clear that its top priority was to eliminate the flow of fentanyl into its borders. In response to this, the Sinaloa cartel was forced to adapt once again. While its traditional drug routes were still valuable, the cartel quickly recognized the need to diversify into new markets. The global demand for fentanyl, methamphetamine, and synthetic opioids had surged in the wake of the opioid crisis, and the Sinaloa cartel was keen to capitalize on this shift. The cartel began to establish new partnerships with Chinese criminal syndicates, who had the capacity to produce vast quantities of fentanyl and its precursors. These Chinese connections allowed the Sinaloa cartel to tap into the lucrative fentanyl trade, which was rapidly overtaking heroin as the drug of choice in the U.S. and other Western markets. The cartel's ability to shift its focus to synthetic drugs was a testament to its resilience and its capacity to adapt to the ever-changing drug landscape. However, this new direction came with its own set of challenges. The U.S. government, in particular, had shifted its focus to the fentanyl trade, recognizing it as one of the most pressing threats to public health. The DEA and other law enforcement agencies began targeting the international networks responsible for fentanyl trafficking. In response, the Sinaloa cartel had to become even more secretive and innovative in its operations. The cartel employed increasingly sophisticated methods to transport fentanyl across borders, from hidden compartments in vehicles to remote airstrips and clandestine shipments by sea. Despite these efforts, the growing international cooperation between U.S. and Mexican authorities made it more difficult for the cartel to operate under the radar. Meanwhile, the Sinaloa cartel's internal leadership struggles were becoming more apparent. While figures like Ismael El Mayo Zambada had long been behind the scenes, his increased visibility after El Chapo's fall brought with it new challenges. Zambada, known for his methodical and cautious approach to cartel leadership, found himself in a precarious position. His long-standing relationship with El Chapo had been one of mutual respect and collaboration, but now, with the Sinaloa cartel fractured and divided, Zambada's leadership was being questioned. As El Chapo's sons, the Chapitos, sought to assert their authority, they found themselves facing resistance from other factions within the cartel. The old guard, loyal to El Mayo and other figures within the cartel's leadership, was not willing to simply hand over control to the younger generation. This power struggle led to an increased level of internal strife within the cartel, which only served to weaken its operations. The once unified Sinaloa cartel was now splintering into rival factions, each seeking to carve out its own piece of the drug trade. While the cartel still maintained control over key smuggling routes and territories, the internal divisions were becoming more pronounced. The Chapitos, despite their bloodline and the resources they had inherited from their father, were still inexperienced compared to their father and untested in the cutthroat world of cartel leadership. Their struggle for dominance within the Sinaloa cartel was a significant factor in the cartel's ability to maintain its hold over its vast empire. At the same time, the rise of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, under the leadership of Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes added a new layer of complexity to the cartel wars in Mexico. The CJNG, a violent and rapidly expanding cartel, was now challenging the Sinaloa cartel for control of the country's most lucrative drug trafficking routes. The CJNG's ruthless tactics, which included mass killings, the use of car bombs, and targeted assassinations, made them a formidable adversary. Their rise was a direct challenge to the Sinaloa cartel's long-standing dominance, and the two cartels engaged in a brutal battle for control of Mexico's drug trade. This new dynamic of cartel warfare was not just about territory, it was about survival. The violence between the Sinaloa cartel and the CJNG reached new heights, with both cartels targeting each other's leaders, members, and associates. The once dominant Sinaloa cartel now found itself locked in a vicious fight with a newer, more aggressive rival. The CJNG's brutal tactics had proven effective in carving out territory for itself, and the Sinaloa cartel was finding it increasingly difficult to hold on to its former strongholds. As the cartel wars intensified, the Mexican government found itself caught in the middle. While the government had long been seen as complicit in the drug trade, it was now facing increasing pressure from both domestic and international sources to take action. The U.S. government had made it clear that it expected Mexico to do more to fight the cartels, and this pressure only escalated after El Chapo's conviction. The Mexican government had long struggled with corruption and inefficiency within its law enforcement and military forces, and the rise of cartels like the CJNG only deepened the crisis. The government's inability to effectively combat the cartels made it clear that the Sinaloa cartel's power was not only entrenched in its leadership but also in its deep ties to the political establishment. While the battle for control between the Sinaloa cartel and the CJNG raged on, the global drug market was also undergoing a transformation. The fentanyl epidemic in the United States had reached catastrophic levels, and the U.S. government was increasingly focused on dismantling the international networks that were responsible for trafficking this deadly drug. The Sinaloa cartel, despite its dominance in the heroin trade, had quickly adapted to the rise of fentanyl, securing a foothold in this new and highly profitable market. However, this shift brought with it a new set of risks and challenges. The U.S. government's crackdown on fentanyl trafficking meant that the Sinaloa cartel would have to operate with even more caution and secrecy. Law enforcement agencies, working in tandem with Mexican authorities, began to target the cartel's fentanyl operations with increasing sophistication. In addition to its involvement in the fentanyl trade, the cartel's production of methamphetamine also grew in prominence. Meth had long been a staple of the drug trade, but its rise in the U.S. and other markets meant that the Sinaloa cartel's reach expanded even further. The cartel's ability to shift its focus from traditional drugs to synthetic substances allowed it to diversify its revenue streams, making it more resilient in the face of law enforcement crackdowns. However, as the cartel expanded into new markets, it also faced increasing competition from other groups vying for control of the synthetic drug trade.